It started with a mistake. Not mine, Ethan's. He'd left the tablet open on the kitchen counter, screen glowing, his email inbox fully exposed. I wasn't snooping. I was making tea. I reached for the tablet without thinking, intending to check a grocery list we shared, but what I saw instead froze me mid-sip. A subject line stood out like a siren in a sea of unread newsletters and company memos. Last night was electric. I can still taste you. My heart stalled. I told myself to walk away, to shut it and pretend I hadn't seen a thing, but some instincts don't listen to reason. My thumb moved, treacherous and trembling, tapping the message open. There she was. Vanessa. Vanessa Moore. My sister-in-law. Daniel's wife. The woman who'd smiled at me over countless family dinners, who'd toasted me at the last board meeting for keeping the numbers sharp. Her words in black and white, vulgar and intimate, made my stomach twist into something sharp and unfamiliar. I scrolled. Message after message. Weeks, no, months of deceit spilled out in time-stamped confessions and half-naked selfies taken in hotel mirrors I recognized from Ethan's supposed business trips. Trips that, I now saw, had been billed to the Moore Legacy Group. Line items disguised as client dinners and consulting retreats. My company card. My department. I sat down at the kitchen table, slowly, as if my legs no longer remembered how to hold me. I stared at the screen like it might blink and change. But the truth was solid. Unforgiving. I should have cried. Should have screamed. But I didn't. Instead, I felt a steel thread wind itself around my spine. Cold, taut, strengthening. I was Lena Moore, CFO of one of the most respected family-run firms on the East Coast. A woman who built her reputation on precision, poise, and control. If they thought I would break, well, they didn't know me at all. I logged out of Ethan's email with careful hands, taking screenshots of everything first. I uploaded them to an encrypted folder I named Discrepancies. I backed them up twice, one to the cloud, one to an external drive I kept in the safe. My movements were methodical, detached, like I was auditing someone else's life. Ethan came home late that night. Said he'd missed me. Kissed my cheek. Asked if I'd seen the new quarterly forecast he'd emailed. I told him I hadn't checked yet. I watched him eat dinner. His tie was slightly askew. Vanessa always liked that undone look. He laughed at some story about a client in Chicago, and I nodded along, matching his rhythm. The entire time, my mind ran calculations, not just of the money he'd stolen, but the layers of betrayal he'd wrapped around every lie. It wasn't just the affair. That I could have dealt with privately, painfully, but quietly. It was the misuse of company funds. The ethical breach. The legal ramifications. The risk he'd put the entire Moore name in. He hadn't just cheated on me, he'd tried to bankrupt my integrity. That was unforgivable. The next morning, I made breakfast. French toast, his favorite. I smiled as I set the plate down and kissed his forehead. He didn't notice the slight tremor in my hand or the way I studied his phone out of the corner of my eye. He'd changed his password. Of course, he had. But I had what I needed for now. At the office, I stayed late. Said I had budget revisions. I combed through expense reports dating back 6 months. Anything with Ethan's name or Vanessa's. I started seeing the patterns clearly. Hotel stays that overlapped, meals for 2 listed under solo consultations, spa treatments listed as client wellness. My jaw clenched tighter with every discovery. I copied each one, sorted them into files, marked, time-stamped, cataloged. Vanessa. That part still felt unreal. I kept seeing her smile at me from across boardroom tables, remembering how she once cried on my shoulder during a rough patch with Daniel. The layers of duplicity stung, not just as a wife, but as a professional. She'd leveraged her marriage into proximity, and her proximity into power. This wasn't just a marriage problem. It was a systemic violation. Vanessa had access to the firm's internal communications, marketing plans, client lists. She'd sat in on confidential meetings. I began to notice subtle signs in the reports, credit taken for initiatives she hadn't led, staff reassignments that made no sense in hindsight. People pushed out. Others suddenly promoted without the metrics to back it. I made a second folder, this one titled Vanessa. It filled quickly. The mask I wore each day hardened into something almost elegant. No one suspected. I was the composed Lena they always knew, the numbers queen, the unshakable backbone of the board. Inside, however, the storm gathered force. I wasn't sure yet what I would do. Not exactly. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not allow them to tarnish what I had spent my life building. Ethan and Vanessa thought they were clever. They'd used my silence as their cover. But silence is a temporary thing. And mine was coming to an end. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It wasn't even pretending I didn't know. The hardest part was watching them, Ethan and Vanessa, move through each day like nothing had changed, while I quietly assembled the pieces of their undoing. It was restraint that defined me now. Every morning, I brushed my hair into a sleek twist, slipped on my heels, and walked into more legacy group like I hadn't seen the truth spelled out in bold subject lines and flagged expense reports. They didn't notice the shift, not at first. Ethan still left early, taking calls in the driveway that ended in laughter and the sound of Vanessa's voice echoing through the Bluetooth speaker he forgot was connected. Vanessa still forwarded reports to the board with little, just wanted to help, notes, as though her interference was helpful rather than strategic. I knew better now. I started with the finance department. Every quarter, I did a quiet audit anyway, my personal assurance that our house was in order. This time, I went deeper. I asked Melissa to pull full travel reports for all executives. I told her I was benchmarking usage patterns. It was a believable request. I made similar ones all the time. What I really wanted were Ethan and Vanessa's receipts. And there they were, flight itineraries matching too neatly. Dinners listed at the same exclusive restaurants, charged within minutes of one another. Invoices for driver services booked under different departments, but billed to the same date and time. All of it camouflaged as business, but the numbers told another story. Then came the hotel photos. Ethan, ever careless with tech, had once synced his phone to our shared cloud. He must have forgotten. I hadn't. Late one night, I scrolled through the backups. Among pictures of our daughter's birthday and last year's Christmas tree were dozens of shots he thought he'd deleted, mirror selfies of Vanessa in silk robes, him behind her, grinning like a fool. Each one a dagger. But I didn't let it cut. I saved them to my encrypted drive, renamed the folder Assets. My hands didn't even shake. What unnerved me more was what I found in the HR logs. Vanessa had lodged several quiet complaints over the past year, subtle, not overt. Whispers of lack of support, hostile energy, obstructed collaboration. Each one, when I looked deeper, corresponded with a woman being removed from her path. Sabrina in marketing, suddenly let go for performance misalignment. Nadia from strategic development, whose role was dissolved despite hitting every quarterly target. At the time, I'd accepted the decisions at face value, recommended by Ethan, rubber-stamped by Daniel. Now I saw the pattern. I paid HR a visit, casual and warm, just Lena being thorough. I asked Claire, our HR officer, if she had any old flagged reports or anonymous complaints that hadn't gone anywhere. I said I was revisiting internal dynamics. Claire, sharp and discreet, tilted her head. Are you looking at someone in particular? She asked carefully. I didn't blink. I'm looking at trends. She pulled a folder from her locked drawer. You didn't hear this from me, she said. But something's always felt off. Inside were internal complaints about Vanessa's treatment of staff, coercive language, undermining others in meetings, manipulating project credit. Most were anonymous. A few had names, but those employees had either quit or been shifted to distant departments. None had followed up. Buried issues hidden under professional polish. I thanked Claire and left, folder tucked beneath my arm like any other report. When I got back to my office, I scanned every page, uploading them to my growing archive. Then I looked up Sabrina and Nadia's last known contact information. If they were willing to talk, this web might stretch wider than I thought. I kept my voice light at home. I didn't question Ethan when he said he'd be in Philly for a client dinner next Thursday. I even helped him pick the suit. But while he packed, I checked the company card charges again. The hotel was already pre-booked. Not in Philly. In Manhattan. Same hotel where Vanessa had hosted a branding summit last spring. They weren't even trying anymore. Each discovery made me colder, sharper. I stopped thinking of it as revenge. It wasn't personal anymore. This was a matter of ethics. Of safeguarding a company my daughter would someday inherit. Of protecting the careers Vanessa had trampled to elevate her own. I didn't cry. Not once. But I did rehearse the confrontation in my head. Not screaming. No thrown wine glasses or soap opera dramatics. Just the truth, delivered at the precise moment when it would cause the most rupture. I didn't want privacy. I wanted exposure. If they had built their power through shadows, I would drag them into light. But I wasn't ready yet. Not until I had every last thread. Until the web was complete and I could pull it tight without a single slip. So I smiled. I signed off on proposals, joined strategy calls, even laughed at Vanessa's limp jokes during staff meetings. She didn't suspect a thing. Neither did Ethan. They had no idea the CFO they'd underestimated was quietly loading the bullets behind her smile. And when I pulled the trigger, I would not miss. I didn't plan on telling anyone. It felt safer to keep the storm inside, tightly sealed beneath my skin. But silence, no matter how carefully curated, starts to crack when you stare down betrayal long enough. And sometimes, the person you least expect turns out to be the one who's been watching all along. It was Isla who noticed. She caught me in the hallway outside the executive lounge, coffee in one hand, tablet in the other, my eyes a little too glassy for a woman who prided herself on control. I tried to brush past her with a polite smile, but she blocked the way with a subtle shift of her hip. "You haven't blinked in 20 seconds, she said. "That's either a new superpower or something's wrong." I almost laughed. Almost. "I'm fine. Lena, come on. I know the fine lie. I invented it." She wasn't wrong. Isla had been surviving the Moore family circus longer than most. The youngest of the siblings, she'd always been the observer. The one in the corner, sipping wine, saying little, but seeing everything. She and I had never been close. We were cordial, distant. But I remembered a look she gave Vanessa at last year's fundraiser. A flash of something between suspicion and disgust. At the time, I'd chalked it up to in-law tension. Now, I wasn't so sure. I took a slow breath. "I need to talk to you. But not here." We left the office early that day, claiming a sister-in-law spa date. No one questioned it. We went to a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city instead, far enough from downtown that we wouldn't run into any colleagues, family, or unwanted eyes. The moment we sat down, Isla dropped the mask. "This is about Ethan, isn't it?" My pulse skipped. "What do you mean?" Her eyes narrowed. "He's been lying. I don't have proof, but I've seen things. Vanessa too. She suddenly got promoted to branding advisor out of nowhere. Started dropping names in meetings she had no business attending. And Daniel, he's completely oblivious." I leaned forward. "What if I told you it's worse than that?" Isla blinked. "How much worse?" So I told her. Not everything, not right away, but enough. The affair. The emails. The expense reports. The fake trips funded by our company's money. Vanessa using her proximity to Ethan to slide past accountability, and Ethan letting her because it served them both. Isla didn't gasp or clutch her chest like I expected. She just sat back in her chair, exhaled slowly, and said, "I knew it." "You did?" I didn't have proof. But the way Vanessa talks about Ethan when Daniel's not around, it's disgusting. Like she thinks she owns both men and can play them however she wants. And Ethan, he's always been reckless. But this. I nodded, grateful and shaken all at once. "I'm gathering evidence. Photos. Reports. Former employees Vanessa pushed out. HR logs. Everything." "Good," Isla said without hesitation. "Burn them both to the ground." Her bluntness startled me, and I must have shown it, because she softened. "Sorry, that came out harsh. But I've seen what Vanessa does to people. She manipulates, sabotages, and then plays the victim. She nearly tanked Daniel's partnership deal last year, blamed it on marketing. And no one questioned it because she was just the wife. I think she's been targeting women, especially the ones who threaten her position. Isla's lips pressed into a tight line. She hates women who don't need her approval. That's why she's always trying to one-up you. I never even noticed, I admitted quietly. I thought we were, not friends, but at least allies. She's been studying you, learning how to be you, so she can take what's yours. The words settled like ice along my spine. I had felt that deep down, but hearing it aloud was different. It gave shape to the instinct I'd buried. So what's the plan? Isla asked. You're not going to keep this under wraps forever. No. I want to make it public. But it has to be at the right moment. With undeniable evidence. Not just the affair, everything. The money, the manipulation, the people she's hurt. Isla leaned in, her expression sharper than I'd ever seen. Then let's make it the most public moment possible. I raised an eyebrow. Mom and Dad's 40th wedding anniversary. It's 3 weeks away. You know how massive it's going to be. Everyone in our orbit will be there. Clients, press, family, friends. And Mom's going all out. My mind raced. The Windmere estate. Exactly. If you reveal it then, there's no controlling the narrative. No spin. Just the truth in front of everyone that matters. I sat back, imagining it. The opulence of the estate. The catered elegance. The smug smiles of Ethan and Vanessa as they played the perfect couple. And then, the reveal. Raw, undeniable truth, displayed for all to see. No escape. No rewriting history. It was perfect. You're really willing to help me do this? I asked. Isla didn't flinch. I've been waiting for someone to finally call them out. You're not alone in this, Lena. Not anymore. I hadn't realized how heavy it all felt until she said that. The idea that someone else was willing to carry part of this, someone who knew the players and the stakes, it changed everything. We left the cafe with a plan starting to take shape. Names to follow up on. Documents to secure. And one target event that would change everything. It wasn't just an anniversary anymore. It was the stage for a reckoning. Isla was a sharper ally than I anticipated. Within days of our pact, she brought forward 2 names I hadn't even considered, Sabrina Langley and Nadia Mercer. Both were women Vanessa had crossed paths with during her so-called advisory rise within the company. I remembered Sabrina as a rising star in marketing, known for her bold ideas and meticulous execution. And Nadia had been one of the most analytical minds I'd encountered. She'd nearly doubled engagement in 1 quarter through a strategy Vanessa had publicly mocked before it mysteriously became Vanessa's own initiative. I'd lost track of them after they quietly disappeared, Sabrina under the guise of a creative divergence, and Nadia for team cohesion issues. Back then, I took those reasons at face value. Now I saw them for what they were: convenient exits orchestrated by Vanessa, with Ethan smoothing the path. Isla reached out to both women. They responded immediately. We met with them separately at a quiet hotel suite Isla booked under her friend's name. Neutral ground. The kind of place that offered comfort without being too obvious. I remember how Sabrina walked in first, sleek, professional, and cautious. Her eyes darted around like she expected a setup. I couldn't blame her. I almost didn't come, she said after introductions. But something told me you weren't doing this for show. I'm not, I told her plainly. And I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. She hesitated. Then Saturday, Vanessa played me like a violin. She praised my work, used it in meetings, then said I wasn't a team player. Ethan backed her up. HR gave me a payout with a quiet NDA and told me to walk away. Would you be willing to go on record? I asked, careful not to push. Sabrina looked at me for a long moment. Only if you promise this isn't just about an affair. It's about the system that let her get away with it. It is, I said. The affair is just the thread. I want to tear down the whole fabric. Her shoulders softened. Then I'm in. Nadia's meeting came next. She was more composed, but the steel in her voice told me she'd been carrying this for a long time. Vanessa made me question myself. She'd pull me into meetings, ask for my input, then twist my words into something careless or reckless. She made it look like I didn't understand our own strategies. And Ethan enabled it. He gave her access she wasn't supposed to have. She knew every departmental shift before the rest of us did. I nodded. You're not the only one she's done this to. Nadia folded her arms. Good. Because I want it all out there. I want to see her exposed. With their testimonies, we had the human element. But I needed hard proof to back it. That's when Claire, our HR officer, messaged me one evening simply, I have something you'll want to see. We met after hours in the HR records room, the hum of fluorescent lights making the moment feel more like a crime scene than an office errand. She handed me a manila folder thick with complaint documentation, most never escalated beyond initial intake. These never made it upstairs, she said. Vanessa's name is on half of them. Bullying, micromanaging, taking credit, pressuring junior staff to ghostwrite for her. I scanned them, heart pounding. Most had been resolved without investigation. Some were closed mysteriously, even after multiple reports. Claire's face was grim. I flagged this behavior 6 months ago, but Ethan told me to focus on department morale instead of drama. He silenced you. Not directly. But yes. And I didn't push back hard enough. You're pushing now. I'm in. You need a full timeline? I'll get it. I've kept digital backups, just in case. We shook hands. I left that night with a file thick enough to collapse the illusion they'd built, and the full weight of what we were undertaking began to hit me. Back at home, Ethan kissed my cheek like he hadn't used the company card to buy a luxury spa package for Vanessa 3 days earlier. I sat beside him on the couch while he watched a documentary, and I cataloged transaction logs from the same hour. My hands moved silently across the keyboard while he dozed off, blissfully unaware that every breath he took around me was numbered. Over the next week, Isla and I built a digital dossier. Videos, screenshots, scanned complaints, voice memos from Sabrina and Nadia, transaction trails cross-referenced with trip itineraries. Vanessa's forged initiatives were layered beside the original creator's files. Every lie now had a timestamp. Every deceit a witness. It wasn't just revenge. This was preservation. For every woman shoved out quietly. For every employee too afraid to speak. For the integrity of the Moore name that I had worked so hard to uphold. The file we created didn't just tell a story. It proved one. And soon, the entire board and the world would see it. It was Margaret who finally broke the quiet facade. She wasn't someone you kept secrets from, not for long. As the former CFO of Moore Legacy Group and the matriarch of the family, Margaret Moore had a gaze that could strip away excuses with surgical precision. She didn't ask twice. She simply watched, and when she called me into her study one rainy afternoon, I knew I was out of time. The Windmere estate was quiet that day, the kind of stillness that wrapped itself around you like a velvet robe. Margaret sat near the window, her back straight, her silk blouse pristine despite the growing storm outside. A tray of untouched tea sat between us. I hadn't taken a sip. I've been watching you, she said, voice low but unwavering. You're doing that thing I used to do when I was trying to keep something from Charles. Working late. Smiling too often. Hiding behind precision. I didn't answer right away. My hands were folded neatly in my lap, a reflex of control. But Margaret didn't need an admission. She already knew. I assume this has something to do with Ethan, she continued. And Vanessa. I looked up at her then, finally meeting her eyes. Yes, more than you can imagine. She nodded once. Tell me everything. And so I did. I told her about the emails, the photos, the falsified expenses. I walked her through the internal complaints, the testimonies from Sabrina and Nadia, and the reports Claire had saved. I even showed her the timeline Isla and I had built, a meticulous archive of corruption disguised as competence. She listened without flinching. Her face remained impassive, but I could see it, an old fire catching light behind her eyes. When I finished, Margaret sat back and exhaled slowly. I always knew Vanessa was ambitious, but I underestimated her ruthlessness. And Ethan. I'm ashamed to say I protected him too long. This goes beyond infidelity, I said quietly. They've stolen from the company, sabotaged employees, damaged our reputation. If this ever went public without our control, the entire board could be compromised. Margaret rose to her feet. Then we won't let it come to that. She walked to her desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a thin black leather notebook. There are people I trust, judges, legal advisors, auditors. Quiet professionals. Ones who understand the value of discretion. You'd help me take this public? I'll help you do it correctly. And thoroughly. She looked at me, and there was no doubt in her voice. Lena, you've done the hard part. You held yourself together. You built the case. Now let me do what I do best, protect this legacy. Hearing that, protect this legacy, was like someone had finally opened a door I'd been pounding on in the dark. For weeks, I'd been carrying everything alone, even with Isla's help. But Margaret joining us shifted the weight. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was strategy. Over the next several days, Margaret worked like a woman with decades of power at her fingertips. She called in favors with elite legal teams to begin reviewing our dossier. We handed over everything, the photos, the receipts, the internal documents, and within 72 hours, a former SEC investigator had verified enough of the financial inconsistencies to initiate a quiet review. Margaret contacted an old friend at a major news outlet. She didn't give specifics. Just planted the seed that something significant was developing inside the Moore Legacy Group. That way, when the time came, the media would already be circling, eager and ready. She moved through her network like a seasoned general preparing for war, every call made with purpose, every meeting held behind tightly closed doors. There was no panic in her movements, only precision. I watched her with a quiet awe, reminded again why Charles Moore had deferred to her on every major decision, even after she stepped down. Margaret wasn't just a matriarch. She was a tactician. Meanwhile, Isla and I focused on internal communications. We looped in a few trusted allies within the company, mid-level managers who had also questioned Vanessa's rise, who were now willing to quietly verify statements and track down corroborating evidence. One of them uncovered a file Vanessa had deleted from the shared drive, a branding pitch that mirrored Nadia's original document almost word for word. We restored it. Every new thread made the case stronger, made Vanessa and Ethan's world smaller. And every time I opened the dossier, now renamed Legacy Integrity, I felt something that had been missing for weeks: clarity. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about setting things right. It was about honoring the people who had been silenced, rebuilding the culture of a company that had stood for something once, before power and proximity poisoned it from within. The Windmere estate began its transformation for the anniversary party, with florists and event planners arriving daily. Charles and Margaret had insisted on a grand celebration, decadent, prestigious, unforgettable. They had no idea it would be remembered for entirely different reasons. Ethan and Vanessa were still playing their parts. Ethan had even stopped by my office one morning with coffee and a smirk, clearly pleased with himself. I smiled, took the drink, and set it down without touching it. He didn't notice. Vanessa, meanwhile, was busy coordinating a slideshow for the celebration. She told Isla she wanted to make sure the family's legacy was beautifully displayed. I almost laughed. Because in just a few days, Vanessa would get exactly that, our legacy, unvarnished and unfiltered. And she would be front and center in every frame. 3 days before the anniversary party, the storm finally hit. It began in the boardroom on the top floor of Moore Legacy Group, glass-walled, quiet, always pristine. That morning, I arrived early. I wore navy, not black, calculated professionalism without mourning. My hair was pinned with precision, my makeup sharp but not harsh. I wanted no emotion to betray me. This wasn't grief. It was consequence. Margaret arrived next, brisk and composed, her handbag containing a signed affidavit from our legal team and a list of names that would soon be called upon for damage control. She gave me a short nod, a quiet squeeze of my arm, no theatrics, just solidarity. Daniel came last. Isla had finally told him the truth 2 nights prior. He'd sat silent for nearly 20 minutes after hearing that his wife had not only betrayed him, but done so with his own brother and with his company's money. I didn't expect him to believe it at first, but Daniel wasn't blind, just loyal. And now that the veil had lifted, there was no mistaking the look in his eyes. He wasn't devastated. He was livid. "They'll be here soon," he said, buttoning his jacket with stiff fingers. "You ready?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it. The board of directors filtered in one by one. Some smiled politely. Others looked wary. They could sense tension, though none yet knew the weight of what was about to fall on them. Ethan entered a few minutes late, coffee in hand, tapping his phone as if nothing in the world had changed. Vanessa wasn't far behind, gliding in with that polished smugness she wore like armor. She took a seat at the far end of the table and greeted me with a sly, practiced smile. "Nice to see everyone," she said. "Excited for the anniversary?" Margaret's eyes flicked toward her, unblinking. "It'll be unforgettable." When the room settled, I stood. "There's been a matter brought to my attention," I began, my voice steady and deliberate. "One that affects not only the ethical integrity of our company, but also its financial security and public trust." A rustle moved through the room. Ethan looked up. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, as if trying to anticipate the direction of the speech. I opened the folder in front of me and began distributing copies, one to each board member, Daniel, Margaret, and, finally, Ethan and Vanessa. Inside was a condensed version of the full report: timelines, transaction logs, flagged HR complaints, witness statements, and incriminating emails. Photos. Receipts. Everything we had gathered over the past month, compressed into undeniable truth. I waited until each person had turned a few pages. Gasps broke the silence. A few leaned forward, others recoiled. One director muttered something under his breath and slammed his copy shut. Ethan shifted in his seat. "What is this?" "It's a detailed report," I said, meeting his eyes of fraud, embezzlement, workplace misconduct, and breach of fiduciary duty, most of which tied directly back to you and Vanessa. Vanessa's composure cracked first. Her lips parted in protest, but no sound came. She flipped frantically through the pages, eyes wide, a growing panic rising in her throat. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You're twisting things. This is a personal vendetta." Daniel stood, voice cold. "No, Vanessa. This is the truth. And I'm done being the idiot who didn't see it." The room fell into chaos. Several board members fired off questions. "How long has this been going on? Who else knew? Are there criminal implications?" Margaret raised a hand, silencing the room. "Our legal counsel has reviewed everything. Independent auditors have confirmed fraudulent activity. HR misconduct was buried but verified. And I have already spoken to the authorities." Ethan stood now, blustering. "You can't do this to me. This is my family's company." "No," I said quietly. "It's our company. And you've compromised it." At that, I reached for the final envelope and handed it to the chair of the board. Inside were letters requesting immediate suspension for both Ethan and Vanessa pending formal investigation. Daniel and I had co-signed them. Margaret had endorsed it. The chair didn't hesitate. "Effective immediately," he said, "both Ethan Moore and Vanessa Moore are suspended from all Moore legacy operations, pending a full audit and legal review." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan sat down hard, as if his legs had finally given out beneath him. Vanessa stared at the table like the surface might open and swallow her whole. Then came the final blow. "The FBI has been notified," I added, not looking at them. "They'll be launching a formal investigation into the misuse of company funds and internal fraud. We've provided them everything." No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Margaret, ever the consummate professional, stood and addressed the room. "I suggest we take the next 3 days to finalize internal communications. The press will learn of this eventually. But we'll control the story. We owe our employees that much." People rose slowly, shaken. Papers rustled. Phones buzzed. As we filed out, Ethan reached for my arm. "Lena," he said, his voice lower, hollow. "We can fix this. Please." I looked at him, not with anger, not even with sadness. Just resolve. I already did, I said. By exposing you. And then I walked away. Behind me, the legacy they tried to poison was already beginning to heal. Windmere Estate shimmered with orchestrated perfection. From the gilded gates to the last manicured rose in the garden, everything was exactly as Margaret had envisioned. Elegant, immaculate, and grand enough to mark 40 years of marriage between two titans of industry. It was the kind of celebration society pages fawned over, the kind that whispered power before a single speech was made. But beneath the curated beauty was something rawer, more volatile. Truth, locked and loaded, waiting for the perfect moment. While florists arranged hydrangeas in cascading towers and servers rehearsed the champagne pour, I walked through the estate's corridors with a tablet pressed to my side like a weapon. It held the final version of the presentation, curated not by a party planner, but by me, Margaret, and Isla. Every slide was timed, every clip intentional. It looked like a loving tribute at first, photos of Charles and Margaret through the decades, their children growing into professionals, the firm blossoming into a dynasty. Then it shifted. Emails, financial records, footage, voice memos. Each slide surgically exposing Ethan and Vanessa's web of deceit. Every lie backed by irrefutable evidence. It would begin soft, slow, like a warm reminiscence. And then the impact would land, brutal and clean. There would be no room for denials, no more careful whispers behind closed doors. It would be public. It would be final. Security teams discreetly adjusted their earpieces as they reviewed the guest list. Margaret had hired them privately, professionals from a firm she trusted from her old CFO days, people who knew how to blend in, look unassuming. But when the moment came, they would move fast. The FBI would arrive halfway through the party, timing their entry to match the presentation. Every detail was a ticking clock. Vanessa still didn't know. Neither did Ethan. Despite their suspension, both were invited to the celebration. Margaret insisted on it. She said it was important that they walk in smiling, that they stand in the light one last time before it all burned down. I was still at the estate late into the evening, finalizing everything. Isla sat beside me on the ballroom balcony, sipping a glass of wine and watching the chandeliers catch the dying light. "You sure they won't see it coming?" she asked, nodding toward the grand foyer where a massive portrait of the Moore family was being hung. "Positive," I said. "They're too focused on playing the part." Isla grinned. "It's almost poetic. Vanessa's been practicing her anniversary speech all week. Told Daniel she wants to honor the family legacy." I smirked. "She's about to." We'd tested the slideshow 3 times on a private screen in the estate's office. No glitches. No unexpected transitions. The final file was encrypted and stored on a separate hard drive. Only Margaret, Isla, and I had access. One copy went to the FBI. Another stayed with me. The third, well, that would be loaded into the party's projection system the morning of the event, right under Vanessa's nose. As I walked through the ballroom again, checking placements and audio levels, I caught sight of the enormous display screen framed with flowers and gold filigree. No one questioned why it was there. It looked like a tribute, a grand gesture of family pride. The irony of it made my chest tight with something between satisfaction and sadness. Daniel had kept his distance since the board meeting. He wasn't avoiding me, just processing. His silence wasn't cold, only careful. He'd asked for a few days to let it all sink in. I gave him space. He'd be ready when the moment came. We all would be. Backstage, the event staff rehearsed transitions. The MC practiced introductions, unaware that the cue card tucked into his folder would eventually direct him to the turning point, the moment we'd rehearsed down to the second. After the tribute montage, I'd told him, "Say, now let's celebrate not just the past, but the integrity that will define our future." That's when the real video begins. He'd nodded, none the wiser. The night before the party, I went home and found Ethan sitting on the patio, staring out over our pool like a man still clinging to the illusion that everything could be salvaged. I didn't speak to him. I just walked past him, up to our bedroom, and closed the door. He didn't follow. Let him stew in the silence he created. Let him wonder how and when it would all fall apart. The next morning, I arrived at Windermere early, dressed in ivory silk and confidence. Isla wore emerald. Margaret wore midnight blue. Together, we looked like elegance itself. But beneath our stillness was tension. Finality. Each of us had committed to this, not just for revenge, but for justice. Guests began arriving by noon. Champagne flutes clinked, laughter filled the air. Photographers snapped family portraits against ivy-covered walls. Ethan arrived in a tux that looked too tight around his neck. Vanessa glided beside him, radiant in red, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She kissed Margaret's cheek and whispered something to Isla that made her smirk. They had no idea. Everything was in place. The only thing left was to wait for the clock to strike. And then we'd pull the curtain back. Let the empire see its cracks. And let the liars answer to the truth. There was a moment, just one, when the party felt almost real. When the lights dimmed, and the first notes of the tribute music echoed through the ballroom, and the screen flickered to life, awash in golden nostalgia. Laughter rippled gently through the crowd as childhood photos of Charles and Margaret filled the screen. Their wedding day. The first Moore Legacy office. Baby Isla in Margaret's arms. A video of Daniel riding a tricycle across the old estate lawn. I stood near the back, a flute of champagne untouched in my hand, watching it all unfold like I wasn't in it. Like I was observing someone else's family from behind a one-way mirror. The beauty, the pride, it was all genuine once. But tonight, it was only the setup. Ethan stood near the center of the room, an arm looped lazily around Vanessa's waist. She whispered in his ear, her lips curled in a smirk meant only for him. Across from them, Daniel stared straight ahead, jaw locked, not even pretending to enjoy himself. Isla stood by Margaret, their expressions unreadable but steady. The FBI agents were already inside, blending in, scattered in formal wear, waiting. Then came the cue. The final family photo faded to black, and the MC took the mic with a bright, oblivious smile. "Let's raise our glasses not just to the past," he announced, "but to the integrity that will define our future." I held my breath. 3, 2, 1. The screen lit up again, this time with a grainy hotel surveillance video. The audio clicked in with a sharp buzz before resolving into clarity, Ethan's voice laughing. Vanessa's laugh followed, unmistakable. The timestamp glared in the corner, a business trip, date from last spring. The room froze. Then came the emails. One by one, subject lines populated the screen. "Need you tonight." Booked the suite under Moore Legacy. Charged dinner to the firm, just noted as networking. The words were read aloud in voiceover, cold, emotionless, unmistakably Ethan's and Vanessa's words, transcribed from months of messages. The murmurs began, low and incredulous. The room shifted. People turned. I saw Ethan blink slowly, as if his brain couldn't catch up. Vanessa's lips parted, her smile dying mid-breath. Her grip on Ethan's arm tightened. She looked to me, and in that instant, I knew she understood exactly what was happening. The slideshow continued, now showing expense reports. Highlighted charges, identical hotel bookings under different aliases. Then overlapping calendar entries and internal memos Vanessa had doctored to secure promotions. Statements from Sabrina and Nadia followed, recordings with faces blurred, voices firm. She said if I didn't hand over the pitch deck, she'd make sure I was left off the next round of hires. She presented my campaign as her own, and when I tried to correct it, I was put on probation. There were gasps. A few people put down their drinks. The board members seated near the front stared at the screen like it had grown claws. And then, the final slide. Ethan and Vanessa caught on a private balcony at an exclusive resort. His arm around her. Her hand tucked into his lapel. The caption, Moore Legacy Business Expense, $3,892.19. The lights came on. Silence. Then, footsteps. Two men in dark suits, agents, approached Ethan and Vanessa with quiet authority. Ethan Moore. Vanessa Moore. You're under arrest for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. Please come with us. Vanessa shrieked. No, this is a setup. This is a goddamn trap. Ethan stood frozen, his face pale. Lena, he said quietly, eyes searching mine. Please. You can stop this. I met his gaze. I already did. The agents placed cuffs on them both. Guests backed away, whispering furiously, some with phones already recording. Margaret stepped forward, steady as ever. To our guests, she said calmly, microphone now in her hand, we apologize for the disruption. But the truth deserves light. Moore Legacy Group will not protect corruption, no matter where it hides. Vanessa struggled as they led her out, screaming Daniel's name. He didn't flinch. He never looked at her. The doors shut behind them. There was a beat of stunned silence, then Margaret passed the microphone to me. My hands didn't shake. As CFO, I want to assure everyone, our clients, our partners, and our family, that immediate action is being taken. An independent audit is underway. Those harmed by the misconduct are being contacted. And Moore Legacy will emerge stronger, not in spite of this, but because of it. Applause broke out. Scattered at first, then building. It wasn't celebration, it was solidarity. A collective sigh from people who had seen too much and said too little, now realizing they didn't have to anymore. As I stepped off the stage, Isla was there. She wrapped her arms around me, whispering, "You did it." No, I said. We did. I looked out at the ballroom, crystal chandeliers still glittering, waiters resetting glasses, conversations cautiously beginning again. We had dropped the bomb. But what mattered now was what we built from the ashes. The news broke before dawn. By 6 a.m., our company inboxes were flooded. By 8, the phones wouldn't stop ringing. Every major news outlet had picked it up. Scandal rocks Moore Legacy Group, CFO exposes fraud, FBI makes on-site arrests. They ran the surveillance stills, the financial breakdowns, the victim statements. Vanessa and Ethan's mugshots were plastered side by side on the morning shows, their smug smiles wiped clean, replaced by vacant stares and hollow cheeks. It should have felt like victory. But what settled over me instead was exhaustion, deep and consuming. After the party, I'd gone home and collapsed into bed without changing out of my dress. When I woke the next morning, the silk was wrinkled and stiff, mascara smudged across my cheekbone. But I didn't care. There was no more pretending. By mid-morning, I was back in my office. The board met in emergency session. Daniel chaired the meeting, his voice steadier than I expected. He was quieter now, more measured. But behind his restraint, I could sense a man still processing not just betrayal, but humiliation. I didn't envy him, yet I admired the way he held his ground. Effective immediately, he said, Ethan and Vanessa Moore are terminated from all positions and affiliations with Moore Legacy Group. Their shares are being frozen pending litigation. Internal operations will be managed by Lena Moore, who has been appointed interim CEO by unanimous vote. The words hit me like a thunderclap, not because I was unprepared, but because of what they meant. After everything, after holding this company together from the shadows, I was now stepping fully into the light. Thank you, I said, voice steady. My first priority is stabilizing morale and conducting a comprehensive review. We owe our employees transparency. And safety. No one objected. In fact, several board members leaned forward, eager, grateful even. They needed leadership now. And I was ready to give it to them. That afternoon, I held a town hall for the staff. I stood at the front of the auditorium, the same place where Vanessa had once preened during launch presentations, and I told the truth. All of it. In plain terms. No euphemisms. No vague references to disruptions or personnel changes. There was fraud. There was abuse. And there were people in this building who were silenced and sabotaged. I promise you, that ends now. I saw nods in the crowd, watery eyes, even a few clenched jaws that finally began to release. Sabrina Langley and Nadia Mercer have been reinstated with full back pay and formal apologies. Their positions will reflect the value they always brought to this company, even when others tried to erase it. The applause was instant and thunderous. I hadn't realized how hungry people were for justice until they tasted it. Sabrina returned that week, walking through the front doors in a bold red suit and zero hesitation. Nadia followed a day later, already talking strategy before she'd even unpacked her desk. Watching them step into leadership roles again reminded me why this had all been worth it. I spent the following days in constant meetings, legal, financial, operational. Margaret stayed close, her expertise invaluable. She didn't need to be involved anymore, but she remained anyway, guiding quietly, stabilizing the ground beneath us as we rebuilt. Isla returned to her own work, but remained in every strategy meeting. She'd found her voice through this, sharper, more direct. I think something changed in all of us. We weren't just survivors now. We were architects of something new. Meanwhile, Ethan and Vanessa were indicted formally. Charges included wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, obstruction of justice, and workplace harassment. The FBI confirmed their investigation was expanding. More victims were coming forward. More discrepancies being uncovered. What Ethan and Vanessa had done wasn't just personal. It was systemic. But it was being dismantled now, piece by piece. The media frenzy raged on for weeks, but we controlled the narrative. Margaret's early calls had ensured that. The press saw me not as a woman scorned, but as a leader who refused to let corruption fester behind closed doors. They started calling me the Iron CFO in headlines. I didn't care much for the nickname, but I understood the sentiment. Strength wrapped in precision. A woman who didn't flinch. In quiet moments, I sometimes thought about Ethan, where he was being held. Whether he stared at the ceiling of a cell, wondering how it all unraveled. I didn't hate him, not exactly. What I felt was colder. A distance so wide, there wasn't even room for anger anymore. He had burned everything, and I had walked through the fire. I sat in my office one night, lights low, reviewing the company's new ethics policies with a highlighter in one hand and a pen in the other. Outside, the city buzzed, as relentless and alive as ever. Nadia popped her head in. "You know," she said, "it's strange walking through these halls without flinching." "Thank you for that." I smiled softly. "No one should flinch here." She nodded, then closed the door behind her. And in that stillness, I realized it fully. We weren't just recovering. We were evolving. Healing wasn't about returning to what we were before. It was about becoming something better. Something stronger. Something unbreakable. 1 year later, the building felt different. The Moore Legacy Group headquarters still stood tall, the same glass and stone symbol of old wealth and corporate power, but everything inside had changed. There was a lightness now, less polished intimidation, more grounded purpose. You could feel it in the way people walked through the halls, in the open doors, in the quiet confidence that had taken root. I stepped out of the executive elevator and looked down the corridor, now lined with framed testimonials from employees across departments. They weren't accolades or awards, they were stories. Statements about the turning point, about coming forward, about being heard. One read, "The day she listened, I remembered what integrity feels like." Another simply said, "Truth mattered here." Finally, the Moore Foundation for Corporate Transparency had launched 3 months earlier. A long name for a simple mission: protect whistleblowers, champion ethical leadership, and create safer spaces in industries that had too long been ruled by silence. It wasn't just a side initiative. It was embedded into everything we did now. Each department had built-in accountability teams. HR had been overhauled. Compensation was tied to culture as much as performance. And every executive, myself included, went through quarterly reviews conducted by an independent ethics board. I didn't just sit at the top of the structure anymore. I stood within it. The annual shareholders meeting was today, and for the first time in a decade, it was open to every employee. Not just executives. Not just department heads. Everyone. And they showed up. Janitors in crisp button-downs, software engineers with coffee in hand, interns who'd started last week and already knew they had a voice here. That was the legacy I'd fought to rebuild. As I crossed the lobby, I caught sight of Margaret seated on a bench near the new sculpture installation we'd commissioned, a bronze flame emerging from fractured stone. She looked up and smiled, her silver hair tucked neatly behind her ears. Margaret had stepped back from daily operations, but she still came by once a week. She called it checking the pulse. "You ready for the spotlight again?" she asked, standing as I approached. "More than I was last year," I said with a smile. She chuckled. "Last year, you weren't stepping into a spotlight. You were the spotlight." We entered the conference hall together, and the applause started as soon as we walked in. I didn't shrink from it, not anymore. It wasn't about ego. It was about acknowledgement. For every late night, every hard decision, every line I refused to blur, I took the podium as the crowd settled. My reflection looked back at me from the polished wood, strong, steady, calm. "Good morning," I began, my voice clear in the mic. "A year ago, this company faced a reckoning. Not because we were weak, but because we had the strength to confront the truth." Heads nodded. People listened, not out of fear, but respect. We discovered what happens when ambition is untethered from ethics. And we chose not to bury it. We chose to rebuild louder, brighter, better. I spoke about the reforms, the new protections, the partnerships we'd formed with advocacy groups and ethics watchdogs. I named the names of those who had stood up, spoken out, or stepped in. I didn't make myself the hero. I made it clear. This had always been a collective fight. Today, I concluded, we are no longer just a legacy. We are a promise, to ourselves, to each other, and to the future. As I stepped down, I locked eyes with Daniel near the front row. He gave me a small, solemn nod. We were civil now. Not close, not family like we once were, but there was respect again. He'd been through his own reckoning, grief, therapy, rebuilding, and he'd taken time away from the company, wisely. Now, he consulted quietly, thoughtfully. We didn't speak often, but when we did, it was without bitterness. After the meeting, I lingered near the front of the hall as employees came up to shake my hand, share small victories, or just say thank you. One young analyst looked at me with wide, odd eyes and said, "You made me believe I could lead here someday." That stayed with me. Later that evening, after the crowd had gone and the lights had dimmed, I returned to my office. I stood in front of the wide glass window that overlooked the city skyline. It glittered back at me, chaotic and alive, just like always. But this time, I didn't feel like I was staring at something I had to conquer. I felt like I was part of it, equal, rooted, unafraid. My desk was cluttered with notes for a new mentorship program we were launching. And beneath them, a single photograph I'd kept from the slideshow, one of Margaret and Charles in their early years, standing in front of the First More office. They looked so hopeful, so unaware of what would come. I didn't blame them. Legacies are rarely born from perfection. They are rebuilt from truth. I picked up my pen and signed off on the final approval documents for the Foundation's first nationwide scholarship, available to students pursuing degrees in ethics, compliance, and organizational leadership. The future wasn't just an idea anymore. It was here. It was mine. And I wasn't looking back.